The last thing Emma Martinez needed was another entitled customer at Le Petit Jardin, especially during the lunch rush when her feet were already aching from her morning shift at the diner across town. But there he was, impeccably dressed in what she guessed was a suit worth more than her yearly rent, drumming his fingers impatiently on the pristine white tablecloth. "I've been waiting for 15 minutes, he said, not bothering to look up from his phone. His voice carried that unmistakable tone of someone who'd never heard the word no in his life. Emma bit back the urge to remind him that he'd arrived during peak hours without a reservation. Instead, she plastered on her best professional smile, the one that helped her earn better tips. "I apologize for the wait, sir. What can I get for you today?" He finally looked up, and for a brief moment, his carefully crafted mask of indifference slipped. Their eyes met, and Emma felt an unexpected jolt of electricity course through her. He had striking green eyes, thoughtful and deep, contrasting sharply with his otherwise stern expression. "James," he said, his voice softer now. "James Harrison." He cleared his throat, seemingly caught off guard by his own introduction. "And I'll have the chef's special, whatever that is today." Emma nodded, jotting down his order, trying to ignore how his gaze lingered on her face. She'd learned long ago that men like him, wealthy, powerful, used to getting their way, were best kept at arm's length. She had too much at stake to get distracted by a handsome face, no matter how intriguing those eyes might be. "Right away, Mr. Harrison," she replied professionally, turning to leave. "Wait," he called after her. "Your name?" She hesitated for a moment. "Emma," she answered simply, before hurrying away to place his order. In the kitchen, she leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. She needed this job, both jobs. Actually, her mother's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves, and the experimental treatment Dr. Richardson had suggested was their last hope. The thought of her mother growing weaker each day in their small apartment was enough to steel her resolve. She couldn't afford to let anything or anyone complicate her carefully structured routine. But James Harrison wasn't done complicating things. Over the next week, he became a regular at Le Petit Jardin, always requesting to be seated in her section. He arrived at precisely 1:15 p.m. each day, ordered whatever she recommended, and left generous tips that made her other servers eye her with a mixture of envy and curiosity. It was on a particularly busy Friday when everything changed. Emma was juggling a full section, running on just 4 hours of sleep after spending most of the night at the hospital with her mother, when she heard the familiar voice behind her. "You look exhausted," James said, and for the first time, she detected genuine concern in his tone. Emma turned, nearly colliding with him. He steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow, and she quickly stepped back, maintaining her professional distance. "I'm fine, Mr. Harrison. Your usual table is ready." But James didn't move toward his table. Instead, he studied her face with those penetrating green eyes. "When does your shift end?" "That's not," Emma started, but he cut her off. "Please, just answer the question." "In about an hour," she replied, against her better judgment. "Have dinner with me," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "There's a small Italian place around the corner. Nothing fancy, I promise." Emma's first instinct was to refuse. She had to get to the hospital, check on her mother, make sure she took her evening medications. But something in James's expression made her pause. There was a vulnerability there, hidden beneath the confident exterior, that caught her off guard. "I can't," she said finally. "I have somewhere I need to be." "Tomorrow then," he persisted. "Lunch, dinner, breakfast, whatever works for you." Before Emma could respond, her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. Her heart stopped when she saw the hospital's number flashing on the screen. With trembling fingers, she answered the call, turning away from James. "Ms. Martinez?" Dr. Richardson's voice was grave. "You need to come to the hospital right away. Your mother's condition has deteriorated significantly." The phone nearly slipped from Emma's grasp. The room started spinning, and she might have fallen if not for James's steady hand catching her arm once again. I have to go," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to get to the hospital, but I can't leave my shift, and I don't have time to wait for an Uber." "I'll drive you," James said without hesitation, already pulling out his car keys. "Where's your manager?" Emma wanted to refuse, to maintain the careful boundaries she'd built, but her mother's face flashed in her mind. Every minute could count. "Pierre's in the back," she said weakly. James strode purposefully toward the kitchen, returning moments later with a concerned-looking Pierre. "Family emergency," James explained smoothly. "I'm taking her to the hospital. Send her final paycheck to the address you have on file." "Final paycheck?" Emma asked, confused, as James guided her toward the exit. "I took care of it," he said simply. "You won't have to worry about this job anymore." As they rushed to his car, a sleek black Mercedes that normally would have intimidated her, Emma felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. She didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified that James Harrison had just upended her life in the span of 5 minutes. But as they sped toward the hospital, one thought kept running through her mind. What would be left of her world by the end of this day? The hospital corridors seemed endless as Emma rushed toward the ICU, James keeping pace beside her. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. When they reached the cardiac unit, Dr. Richardson was waiting, his expression grave. "Your mother experienced severe arrhythmia," he explained, his voice gentle but direct. "We've stabilized her for now. But Emma, without the experimental treatment we discussed, I'm not sure how much longer her heart can take this strain." Emma's own heart felt like it might shatter. The treatment, the one that cost more than she could earn in 5 years of double shifts. She'd been trying to save up, taking every extra shift possible, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. "How long?" she whispered. "A few weeks, maybe a month." Dr. Richardson glanced at his charts. "With the treatment, her chances improve significantly, but I understand the financial constraints." "How much?" James's voice cut through the fog of Emma's despair. She'd almost forgotten he was there. "Mr. Harrison, no," Emma started, but James held up a hand. "How much is the treatment?" he asked again, more firmly this time. Dr. Richardson hesitated, looking between them. "The full course is $175,000. Emma watched in stunned silence as James pulled out his phone, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. "I'm transferring the full amount now. Will that allow you to begin treatment immediately?" "James, you can't," Emma protested, but he continued as if he hadn't heard her. "I'll have my lawyer send over any necessary paperwork within the hour. Please begin whatever preparations are needed." His tone was all business, the same one she'd heard him use while making calls at the restaurant. Dr. Richardson nodded, clearly used to dealing with wealthy benefactors. "I'll have my team begin the protocols right away. Emma, you can see your mother now. She's still unconscious but stable." As the doctor hurried away, Emma turned to James, anger and gratitude warring in her chest. "Why would you do that? You don't even know us." James's professional demeanor softened slightly. "I know you," he said quietly. "I've watched you work double shifts, never complaining, always with a smile. I know you're the kind of person who would sacrifice everything for someone you love." He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his face. I wish I'd had someone like you in my family." Before Emma could respond, a nurse called her over to review some paperwork. James took that moment to slip away, leaving Emma torn between relief and an inexplicable sense of loss. The next few days passed in a blur of hospital visits and worried anticipation. Her mother responded well to the initial treatments, showing more energy than she had in months. Emma split her time between the hospital and her remaining job at the diner, trying not to think about how she would ever repay James's generosity. It was during a rare, quiet moment at her mother's bedside, watching the sunset paint the hospital room in shades of gold, that Emma's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Have dinner with me. Not as a thank you, not as an obligation. Just dinner." Emma stared at the message, knowing it had to be from James. She'd been avoiding thinking about him, about the way he'd swooped into her life and changed everything with a few taps on his phone. Part of her wanted to refuse, to maintain the walls she'd built around her heart. But another part, one she'd been trying to ignore, couldn't forget the look in his eyes when he'd mentioned his family. Her mother stirred, opening her eyes with more clarity than Emma had seen in weeks. "You're thinking too hard," she said softly. "I can hear it from here." Emma managed a small smile. "Just work stuff, Mama. How are you feeling?" "Better than I have in years, thanks to your young man." "He's not my young man, Mama. He's just... I don't even know what he is." Her mother reached out, taking Emma's hand in hers. "Mi amor, I've watched you put your life on hold for me for too long. This man, he didn't just save my life, he gave you a chance to live yours." "It's not that simple," Emma protested. "He's from a completely different world. And now I owe him so much." "Some debts," her mother interrupted, "aren't meant to be repaid with money." Before Emma could argue further, her phone buzzed again. "The car is waiting outside whenever you're ready." No pressure, no expectations, just two people getting to know each other. Emma looked at her mother, who smiled knowingly. "Go," she said. "I'll still be here tomorrow." With trembling fingers, Emma typed out her response. "Give me 20 minutes." In the hospital bathroom, she did her best to freshen up, suddenly very aware of her wrinkled clothes and messy hair. When she finally made her way outside, she found not the Mercedes she expected, but a modest black sedan with a driver holding the door open. The drive took them away from the city's gleaming downtown, past the fancy restaurants she'd expected, and into a quiet residential neighborhood. They pulled up to a small house with warm lights glowing in the windows. James was waiting on the porch, and Emma was surprised to see him dressed casually in jeans and a simple button-down shirt. "I thought we could talk somewhere private," he explained as she approached, "where we can both be ourselves, without pretense." Inside, the house was cozy and lived in. Nothing like the mansion she'd imagined he called home. The kitchen smelled of garlic and herbs, and she could see a pot simmering on the stove. "You cook?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. James smiled, and for the first time, it reached his eyes. "There's a lot you don't know about me, Emma Martinez. Just like there's a lot I'd like to learn about you." He gestured toward the kitchen. "Will you let me?" As Emma followed him into the warmth of the kitchen, she felt something shift inside her. The walls she'd built so carefully began to crack, just a little, letting in the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was more to James Harrison than she'd allowed herself to see. But as they settled in to what promised to be an illuminating evening, neither of them could have predicted how their carefully constructed worlds were about to collide in ways that would test them both beyond anything they'd imagined. The pasta was perfectly al dente, the sauce rich with fresh herbs and something deeper, perhaps the taste of honesty that seasoned their conversation. Emma watched James move around the kitchen with surprising ease, his practiced movements telling the story of someone who'd spent considerable time learning to cook. "My mother taught me," he explained, catching her curious gaze. "Before she passed away, she believed every person should know how to create something with their own hands." He paused, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. "She wasn't like most people in our social circle. She came from a working-class family in Boston, met my father when she was waitressing her way through college." Emma felt something shift in her understanding of him. "Is that why you kept coming to the restaurant?" James's smile held a touch of sadness. "I recognized something in you, that same determination she had. But it was more than that. You reminded me of what our family used to be before—" A sharp ring interrupted his words. James glanced at his phone, his expression darkening. "I need to take this, I'm sorry." He stepped into the next room, but his voice carried back to her. "Father, this isn't a good time. No, I won't sign those papers. Because it's wrong, and you know it." Emma tried not to listen, but the tension in his voice was impossible to ignore. When he returned, the easy warmth from earlier had vanished, replaced by a rigid formality she recognized from their first meeting at the restaurant. "I'm sorry, but something's come up at the office." I need to go. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that seemed deeply familiar to him. My driver can take you home or back to the hospital, wherever you need to go. James, Emma said softly. What's wrong? He looked at her for a long moment as if weighing a decision. Finally he spoke, his voice tight with controlled emotion. My father is trying to force through a corporate restructuring. He wants to close down several of our smaller manufacturing plants, move operations overseas. 3,000 people would lose their jobs, and you're fighting him on this. I'm trying too. As CFO, I have some leverage, but he shook his head. My father only sees numbers on a spreadsheet. He doesn't see the families, the communities that would be destroyed. James's hands clenched into fists, just like he didn't see what he was doing to our family, pushing my mother away with his obsession with profit margins and market shares. Emma stood, moving closer to him. Is that why you helped me, because of your mother? No, he said quickly, then paused. Maybe partly, but mostly because you showed me something I'd forgotten existed. Genuine care for others, without expecting anything in return. His phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. I have to go. There's an emergency board meeting. As he gathered his things, Emma noticed his hands shaking slightly. Making a decision, she touched his arm. Let me come with you. James froze. Emma, this isn't your fight. No, but I know something about fighting for family, for what's right. Maybe having someone in your corner wouldn't be the worst thing. 20 minutes later, Emma found herself in the gleaming headquarters of Harrison Enterprises, feeling decidedly out of place in her simple clothes among the suits and power dresses that filled the executive floor. James had insisted on stopping at a high-end boutique on the way, buying her a sleek black dress that probably cost more than her monthly rent. But she still felt like an imposter. The boardroom was intimidating. All glass, chrome, and power. William Harrison, James's father, sat at the head of the table, his silver hair and steel-grey eyes marking him as clearly as a crown would have. When he saw Emma enter behind James, his expression shifted from surprise to calculated assessment. James, he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, I wasn't aware we were bringing guests to this private meeting. Emma is here as my advisor, James replied coolly. Since we're discussing the future of thousands of families, I thought it might be helpful to have someone who understands the human cost of our decisions. William's eyes narrowed. And what qualifies Ms. Martinez? Emma supplied, forcing herself to meet his gaze. What qualifies Ms. Martinez to advise on matters of corporate strategy? James opened his mouth to respond, but Emma stepped forward. I qualify because I've lived it, Mr. Harrison. I know what it means to work 2 jobs to support a family. I know what it's like to wonder if you'll be able to make rent because your employer decided to cut costs by reducing hours. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They're real people with real lives. The room fell silent. William Harrison studied Emma with an intensity that reminded her of a predator assessing prey. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. James, he said, still looking at Emma, I see you've inherited your mother's unfortunate habit of collecting strays. Tell me, Ms. Martinez, how much did my son pay for your mother's medical treatment? Emma felt the blood drain from her face. James stepped forward, his voice dangerous. That's enough, Father. No, I don't think it is. William stood, his presence filling the room. You see, I've had you investigated, Ms. Martinez. Standard procedure when someone gets close to a Harrison. Your mother's experimental treatment, your sudden resignation from Le Petit Jardin, the convenient timing of it all. Tell me, what's your angle? How much more do you think you can get from my naive son before he realizes he's being played? The accusation hit Emma like a physical blow. She looked at James, seeing the doubt flicker across his face for just a moment before he masked it. That moment of uncertainty was all it took for her walls to slam back into place. I don't need to listen to this, she said, her voice trembling with hurt and anger. I never asked for James's help. I never wanted any of this. She turned to leave, but William's voice stopped her. "Wait. Since you're here, why don't we make this interesting? I'll make you a deal, Ms. Martinez. Walk away from my son now, never contact him again, and I'll not only cover your mother's entire treatment, but I'll set up a trust fund to ensure her care for the rest of her life." Emma felt sick. Behind her, she heard James's sharp intake of breath. She turned slowly, facing William Harrison with all the dignity she could muster. "You want to know what qualifies me to be here, Mr. Harrison? The fact that I would never put a price tag on someone's heart. Not your son's, not those workers you want to lay off, not anyone's." She pulled off the expensive dress jacket James had bought her, laying it carefully on a chair. "Keep your money, all of it. I'll find a way to pay back what James gave us, even if it takes the rest of my life." As she walked out of the boardroom, her simple clothes now a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame, she heard the beginning of what sounded like an explosive argument between father and son. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop, until she was out of the building and into the cool night air. Only then did she let the tears fall, mourning not just her own shattered hopes, but the glimpse she'd had of a different kind of life, one where love and integrity meant more than profit margins and power plays. Her phone buzzed with James's name on the screen, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. Some chasms, she realized, were too wide to cross, no matter how much your heart wished otherwise. The next week passed in a blur of hospital visits and double shifts at the diner. Emma had managed to get her old job back, though her manager made sure she understood it was a favor that wouldn't be repeated. She ignored the growing stack of missed calls and messages from James, focusing instead on the practical challenges ahead. Her mother's continuing treatment, the mounting bills, the impossible task of paying back James's generosity. Her mother watched her with knowing eyes, but said little, understanding that some wounds needed time to heal. The experimental treatment was working. She grew stronger each day, but Emma couldn't fully celebrate, knowing the cost of that miracle came with strings she couldn't bear to acknowledge. It was during a quiet afternoon shift at the diner when everything changed again. Emma was refilling coffee cups when she heard the familiar chime of the door. Looking up, she froze. It wasn't James who entered, but his father, William Harrison, looking decidedly out of place in his $1,000 suit. He sat at the counter, directly in her section, his presence drawing curious looks from the regular customers. Emma approached him with professional detachment, coffee pot in hand. "What can I get you, Mr. Harrison?" He studied her for a moment, then said quietly, 5 minutes of your time, that's all I ask." Emma glanced at her manager, who nodded slightly. Apparently, William Harrison had already secured permission for this conversation. She set down the coffee pot and followed him to a corner booth, maintaining a careful distance. "My son resigned yesterday," William began without preamble. "Walked away from his position as CFO, his seat on the board, his inheritance, everything." He pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. "Do you know what this is?" Emma shook her head. "This is the proposal James was working on before our confrontation. A complete restructuring plan that would save those manufacturing jobs while actually increasing company profitability through innovation and workforce development." He opened the folder, revealing pages of detailed analysis. It's brilliant work that could save thousands of jobs and transform our company's future. But James refuses to implement it unless I step down as CEO. Emma's heart clenched. "Why are you telling me this?" William's expression softened slightly, showing the first genuine emotion she'd seen from him. "Because in 30 years of running this company, I've never seen my son fight for anything the way he fought for those workers. The way he fights for you." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "You remind me of someone, Ms. Martinez. Someone I lost because I was too proud, too convinced of my own righteousness to see what really mattered." "His mother," Emma said softly. "Sarah." William's voice cracked slightly on the name. "She was a waitress too, you know, the most genuine, compassionate person I'd ever met. I promised her the world, but somewhere along the way, I forgot what made that world worth having." He pulled out an old photograph, sliding it across the table. "This was taken the year before she died." Emma looked at the photo. A younger William stood with his arm around a beautiful woman, with James's green eyes and warm smile. They were in a kitchen, much like the one where James had cooked for her, both covered in flour and laughing. "She taught him to cook," William continued, his voice distant. "Said a man who could create something with his own hands would never lose touch with what matters most in life. I used to tease her about it. The CEO's wife teaching our son to be a chef." He smiled sadly. "I was a fool." "Why did you investigate me?" Emma asked, the hurt still fresh in her voice. "Because I saw history repeating itself. A wealthy Harrison man falling for a working-class woman with a heart of gold. I thought I was protecting him, just like my father thought he was protecting me when he tried to separate me from Sarah." William's hands trembled slightly. "But all I've done is push away the only person who reminds me of her. Both of them, actually." Emma sat in stunned silence, trying to process this unexpected vulnerability from a man she'd seen as nothing but a cold-hearted businessman. "James is staying at Sarah's old house, the one you visited," William continued. "He's talking about selling his shares in the company, using the money to start a foundation for working families. He won't answer my calls, won't even look at the messages I've sent trying to make things right." He met Emma's eyes directly. "He needs someone who understands both worlds, someone who can help him find balance between doing good and doing well. He needs you." "Mr. Harrison," Emma started, but he held up a hand. "Please let me finish. I was wrong about you, Ms. Martinez. Wrong about a lot of things. The night of that board meeting, watching you walk away from a fortune to protect your principles, it was like seeing Sarah all over again. The woman who taught me that real worth isn't measured in dollars and cents." He stood, straightening his suit jacket. "The treatment funds have been placed in an irrevocable trust for your mother. It's not a bribe or a payment. Consider it penance for an old man who took too long to learn what his wife tried to teach him." He placed a small envelope on the table. "Inside is the key to Sarah's garden shed. James spends every evening there, tending the herbs she planted. It was their special place." He smiled faintly. "He's become quite the gardener, just like she was." As William turned to leave, he paused. "Ms. Martinez, Emma, my son is a better man than I ever was, largely because of his mother's influence. Don't let my mistakes cost him the chance to be happy. Some debts can't be repaid with money, but they can be honored by learning from them." Emma watched him walk away, her mind swirling with new understanding. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers, finding not just the key, but a small, worn photo. It showed a young James, maybe 7 or 8, proudly holding up a basket of fresh herbs with his mother, both of them sharing that same warm smile she'd come to cherish. Her phone buzzed, another message from James. This time she found herself wanting to read it, wanting to understand the man who'd risked everything to stand up for what he believed in. But as she reached for her phone, her manager called her back to work, leaving her caught between two worlds, just as James and his mother had been. The weight of William Harrison's words stayed with her through her shift, through the bus ride to the hospital, through her evening routine of checking on her mother. The key in her pocket felt like it carried the weight of not just one possible future, but the echoes of a past that was asking for redemption. As she sat beside her sleeping mother that night, Emma found herself at a crossroads. The walls she'd built to protect herself were crumbling, but maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing. After all, some of the most beautiful gardens grow in places where old walls have fallen, making room for something new to bloom. The garden was exactly as Emma remembered it from that first evening, though now she noticed details she'd missed before. Herbs grew in carefully tended beds, their arrangement practical yet beautiful, just like the woman who had first planted them. The setting sun cast long shadows across the small space, and there, kneeling among the plants, was James. He didn't look up as she approached, too focused on the delicate work of transferring seedlings into fresh soil. His expensive suit had been replaced by worn jeans and a faded t-shirt, and his hands were covered in earth. In that moment, he looked more real to her than he ever had before. "Your mother's rosemary is still growing," he said quietly, still not looking up. 15 years, and it's still here. She always said some roots go deeper than we can see. Emma's fingers tightened around the old photograph in her pocket. "Your father came to see me." Now James did look up, his green eyes shadowed with emotion. "I'm sorry. Whatever he said, whatever he offered, he showed me who you really are," Emma interrupted. "Who you've always been." She pulled out the photograph, holding it up in the fading light. "This boy who learned to cook with his mother, who tends her garden, who gave up everything to fight for what's right." James stood slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I should have fought harder that night in the boardroom, should have defended you." "No," Emma said firmly, "I needed to fight that battle myself. And you needed to fight yours." She stepped closer, really looking at him. "You resigned." "I couldn't stay, not after everything I thought I was doing to change things from the inside. It wasn't enough. My father is trying to change," Emma said softly. "He showed me his own photographs today. Told me about your mother, about how he lost his way after losing her." James's breath caught. "He never talks about her. Not since." "He said something else too, about your proposal for the company." Emma moved closer still. "He said it was brilliant. Said it could save those jobs and make the company stronger. It doesn't matter now." I walked away. "It matters to 3,000 families. It matters to your mother's legacy." Emma reached out, touching his soil-stained hand. "Your father offered to step down as CEO. He wants you to implement your plan." James stared at their joined hands. "Why are you here, Emma?" "Because I finally understand what your mother tried to teach you both. About creating something with your own hands, about tending what matters." She squeezed his hand. "Because some roots do go deeper than we can see." James pulled away, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "I'm not the man you think I am. I tried to buy your attention with expensive restaurants, tried to solve your problems with money." "No," Emma cut him off. "You showed me who you are in a simple kitchen, cooking pasta. You showed me in a boardroom, fighting for people you'd never met. You showed me every time you came to that restaurant, seeing me, really seeing me, when everyone else looked right through me." She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Your father didn't offer me money this time. He offered me understanding. Showed me that sometimes the biggest act of love is admitting when you're wrong and trying to make it right." James's voice was rough with emotion. "And have you come to understand?" Emma reached up, touching his face gently. "I understand that some debts can't be repaid with money. They can only be repaid by honoring what matters most." She smiled softly. "Your mother knew that, and now so do I." In the growing twilight, surrounded by the herbs his mother had planted, James finally let his walls crumble completely. He pulled Emma close, and when their lips met, it tasted of rosemary and new beginnings. 3 months later, the Harrison Enterprises manufacturing plants were thriving under a new worker-focused initiative. James, as the new CEO, had implemented his innovative restructuring plan, with his father serving as a senior advisor, their relationship healing slowly through shared purpose and understanding. Emma continued working at the diner, but now only part-time. The rest of her time was split between managing a new Harrison Foundation program, supporting working families, and helping her mother, now fully recovered, tend a community garden project they'd started together. The garden behind Sarah Harrison's old house had expanded, now producing herbs for a small farm-to-table restaurant James and Emma were planning to open. A place where CEOs and waitresses could sit at the same tables, sharing food made with love and understanding. On warm evenings, you might find them there in the garden, Emma and James, their hands dirty from working the soil together. Sometimes William would join them, sharing stories about Sarah that he'd kept locked away for too long, and if you looked closely, you might see something rare and precious growing among the herbs. The kind of love that, Like Sarah's rosemary, sends its roots deep and survives every season. Emma's mother liked to say that the best gardens grow in soil, enriched by what came before. Looking at the life she and James had built together, Emma understood what she meant. Their love had grown not in spite of their differences, but because of them, nurtured by the wisdom of a woman who knew that the truest wealth comes from getting your hands dirty and your heart involved in creating something real. As the sun set on another day in the garden, James pulled Emma close, both of them content in the knowledge that they had found something rarer than wealth, more precious than power. They had found a love worth cultivating, a legacy worth growing, and a future they would tend together. "Your mother would have loved this," Emma whispered, looking at their flourishing garden. James smiled, the same warm smile she'd first fallen for, now unguarded and full of joy. "She does love it," he said softly. "I see her every time we're out here together, every time we create something with our own hands." And in the gentle evening breeze, among the herbs that Sarah Harrison had planted so long ago, two worlds that once seemed impossibly far apart had finally grown together, creating something new and beautiful. Proof that with enough love, patience, and understanding, any garden can bloom, any heart can heal, and any divide can be bridged. They had learned that true worth isn't measured in dollar signs or social status, but in the soil of shared dreams and the harvest of hearts that dare to grow together. And that perhaps was the greatest lesson Sarah had left them all, that love, like her garden, only needs willing hands and open hearts to flourish. What would you do if love meant choosing between your principles and security? Have you ever experienced a moment where standing up for what's right cost you something precious? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story could inspire others who are facing similar choices. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. With your support, we can continue bringing you powerful emotional stories every day that remind us of what truly matters in life. And if you're looking for another journey that will capture your heart, check out our latest story appearing on the left of your screen. Trust me, it's a tale of courage, redemption, and unexpected love that will leave you breathless. You won't regret clicking play. Remember, every subscription helps us continue sharing these life-changing stories. Join our community of dreamers, believers, and those who know that the best stories are the ones that touch our souls. See you in the next story.